A couple of months ago, I was in one of these long sessions of procrastination, fueled by boredom mostly. I began to wander through Wikipedia. I began reading about ducks, and somehow I ended up reading about scientific racism. And that led me to a certain story, the story of Curryback. Curryback was a girl aged 17 who was deemed alongside the government as feeble-minded and sexually promiscuous. She also had a daughter called Vivian. The three of them were secluded in a mental health institution. Then the government evaluated a 6-month-old Vivian and concluded that the Buck heritage was corrupted by quote-unquote undesirable genes. You will think that this anecdote is from some sort of fascist authoritarian government, or it happened during the Holocaust, but no. This happened in Virginia, in the United States, during the early 1900s, a time when the American Eugenics movement was at its peak, a time when eugenics was supported by the people, by politicians of the size of Roosevelt, and by scientists like Alexander Graham Bell. And they weren't idiots exactly. But how did it happen? How did people and even scientists accept and support these types of policies? And what can we learn from it? How did we change? Okay, but some context first. What is eugenics in the first place? Eugenics is a scientific movement that aims to stop certain people with certain traits from reproducing. That means drug addicts, criminals, the disabled, the mentally ill, even immigrants, people of color, or single mothers for some reason. It was popular among the wealthy elite because ultimately it argues that the rich and powerful were so because of their superior culture and values, while the poor were so because they were inherently inferior and, well, they couldn't do anything about it. It found support in the US because of the progress of socially acceptable forms of sterilization, like vasectomies, and because it became an influential political movement. A movement influential enough to make baby competitions something popular, to be taught in American public schools and colleges, and to pass laws in many states, as you can see in this picture. California, Virginia, and plenty of other states had laws under eugenic principles. Eugenics, despite its support in the US, ultimately fell off grace after World War II because of Nazi Germany's use of it to support the policies and to justify the Holocaust and the many atrocities that they did. And after that, eugenics was completely deemed unacceptable as it is, and it was discredited and ultimately rejected by society. The end. Everyone's happy. Well, no. The consequences of eugenics weren't exactly light. In Nazi Germany, for example, being the most extreme case, there were 400,000 cases of forced sterilization of people deemed as feeble-minded, imbeciles, mentally ill, disabled, and so on. Also, there's the Holocaust, which is the Holocaust. And in the case of the US, the laws that were passed by the eugenics movement resulted in more than 60,000 people being sterilized, including, well, the categories previously mentioned, in more than 30 states until the 1970s. As we can see, in California, the state that had the greater number of cases of forced sterilization, there were higher rates among minorities, like poor Latino mothers, which reveals a certain bias towards these populations. So now that we know the context, we can begin to answer the question, how did science and how did people change? There was a need in the early 20th century to create scientific systems to explain everything. History and economics became more scientific. Eugenics, craniology, and other biased and prejudiced and completely failed sciences were accepted and considered the latest and most modern thing that science could offer at the time. Instead, they were really the product of the different biases and prejudices of their creators, who were trying to rationalize inequality. Of course, these concepts changed. Methodologies were improved, for example, with peer-reviewed studies. There also has been progress on how cultures work and evolve and how genetics and our bodies work in general. Now we know for sure that eugenics wasn't scientific at all, because most of the traits that it studied, for example, alcoholism, are not quite inheritable. And because really most of its goals were subjective. You can't really determine when a person is feeble-minded and when a person has average intelligence. The consensus, after all, is that we as human beings are the result of our genetics interacting with our environment. We change, we evolve, we learn. Our intelligence, our capacity grows over time, and it's not defined by, let's say, a number. That's the reason we as a species managed to survive for so long. And that's why we came to this day. Because we learn. That's what makes us different. Now, in science at least, we know now how our biases and ideologies influence our views of the world and have different mechanisms that take our subjectivity into account. But now that we know how scientists and intellectuals accepted eugenics, we can answer the other question. How that many people accept eugenics as well? As I said, the early 1900s was a time of change. Science took great steps, okay? But it was also a time of social change. This was the time of the first wave of feminism, for example, the one that managed to vote. But there was still a lot of work to do. Racism and the ideas of white supremacy were quite alive in the American discourse. The American Civil War was just a couple of decades ago. A war where people died and fought because they wanted to maintain slavery. So even after losing the Civil War, a lot of Americans wanted to justify their beliefs by seeking kind of like an objective proof. And as you can see, as you saw earlier, it wasn't really about improving or helping mankind. It was really about systemic discrimination against the populations deemed as inferior. Remember the statistics in California. Many of them were poor Latino mothers. And that leads us back to Curryback. The real reason why Curryback was the first person to be sterilized under eugenic principles in the US is because of rape. She was raped and had Vivian. The blame wasn't her, and to avoid shame, she was put in a mental health institution with her daughter, of course. The sad thing is, after all, Curryback was a girl of average intelligence. So was Helen Buck, her mother, and so was Vivian Buck, her daughter. She was only a poor girl who suffered a monstrous crime. Many people had the same fate. That's the cost of prejudices. That's the cost of hate. After World War II, the social climate became more egalitarian, so to speak, because the world saw how harmful these ideas were. And so eugenics died with the Nazis, right? Stephen Jay Gould, a paleontologist, biologist, and historian of science, who is also one of my favorite authors of all time, talked back in '85 about the discourse in Singapore that resembled the already rejected ideas of the American eugenics movement. This idea of stimulating the reproduction of the quote-unquote desirable population and discouraging the reproduction of the undesirable population, which in this case is the less educated population. This was in the 80s, 40 years after World War II. Stephen Jay Gould argued that ideas, even dead ideas that have been completely disproven and rejected, can come back regardless of everything. To quote him, the most erroneous stories are those we think we know best, and therefore never scrutinize or question. We need to learn from the past. We need to question. We need to question our biases, our prejudices, our ideas, our values, or else we are doomed to make the same mistakes.